You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
As a parent, I don't know if you've ever done the scary calculus to figure out how long would it take me to get to my kids if they needed my help. With Kylie being in San Diego, I know I can drive, and my aggressive driving will get me there relatively quickly. But with Catherine in New York, it's at least 8 hours of a trip, and that's if I could get on a flight immediately. And that's not the first time that I've felt powerless as a parent when I imagine the what-if scenarios. But I hate every moment when my illusion of control and safety is challenged, when I am now powerless to do the thing that may happen, even though it's likely not to. Which makes our story today all the more unsettling. They didn't have cell phones to just check in with one another. Can you imagine growing up as a parent without access to your kids that way? But a father in this story will journey for days across mountainous terrain in order to find a miracle somewhere in order to see his kids saved. This is John chapter 4, 46 through 54. And then Jesus came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had changed the water into wine. Now there was a royal official whose son lay ill in Capernaum. And when he had heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. And Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." And the official said to him, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started on his way. And as he was going down, his slaves met him and told him that his child was alive. And so he asked the hour when he began to recover, and they said to him, "Yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him." And the father realized that this was the hour that Jesus said to him, "Your son should live." And so he himself believed, along with his whole household. Now this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. And so in the story, we're back in Cana, back now to the on the road from Sepphoris to Capernaum, would cross through Cana and pick up stories about what Jesus was doing. And in these larger towns, places of industry and trade, were also places where Roman officials were concentrated: tax collectors, military officials, civic administrators. And in those larger towns, then too, an ever-present reminder of the power that occupied and oppressed the people in that region. Now, Jesus had just come from Samaria, taking a bit of a long way back into Galilee. And this region, too, was filled with animosity, but from a different direction. It was mostly from the Jewish community toward the Samaritans. A couple hundred years had passed since the center of Samaritan worship was destroyed. And it was a religion that was different enough from the Jewish faith that it was considered inferior and heretical. But when Jesus encounters a woman at a well, their conversation discovers that a common God was enough to overcome the formal boundaries that enemies tend to establish. You know, we like stories like that, right? Where the powerful and respected, like Jesus, make room for the little person, the one overlooked or marginalized. The stories we don't like is what happens when the oppressed are called to love their enemies. For John's first readers, this was a crucial question. In the years following the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Roman emperor had become increasingly cruel. That's what an attempted insurrection will do to you. You'll destroy the city, and then anyone associated with that region, well, they better play nice. More and more crosses are raised, and more lions are fed with the bodies of religious and political dissidents. And so when we read of an official coming from Capernaum begging Jesus for a miracle, we, like John's first readers, lean forward in our seats. Like, how is Jesus going to put this guy in his place? And so when Jesus says, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you won't believe," we're like, gotcha. Now let's see what's going to happen to your kid. But you see, there's something different that happens here. This is one of the only times in the Gospel of John that, although we talk a lot about miracles being signs, here we hear the word signs and wonders, this phrase is meant to call us back to a story from the Hebrew Scriptures. Our imaginations are cast back to another time in history when God's people lay under the thumb of an oppressive regime, back to Egypt, back to Pharaoh, back to Moses, calling down plague after plague to demonstrate God's power. God, speaking in a burning bush, told Moses, "I will show you and Pharaoh my signs and wonders." Back then, the first sign was the Nile turning red like blood, not too far from water being turned into wine. And we may begin to see Jesus now is somehow embodying what Moses did, setting another people free through signs and wonders that might finally topple an empire. Because eventually, while the Nile was turned like blood, sickness would spread across Pharaoh's officials. Eventually, Pharaoh's son would die as the angel of death sweeps across the land, and eventually, as Pharaoh pursues God's people, his entire army is drowned in the sea. And so now here we have another official of another oppressive empire with another son on the brink of death. Now will be the time for Jesus to be like Moses, to demonstrate how the powerful truly are powerless. And maybe our imaginations go in that direction too. Maybe when we imagine our enemies in need, begging us for help, that we just squeeze the boot a little bit tighter so they know what it feels like to be on the other side of things. Sometimes we might even read Jesus' word here as a rebuke. Unless you see signs and wonders, you won't believe. Maybe we are gleeful when we see oppressive officials finally vulnerable, and we hope they get what's coming to them. Maybe we imagine how the sea would swallow them whole, their entire family wiped off the face of the map, in order to ensure God's justice. But what do we do when our enemies come calling for help undeservingly? What we find is that this official has faith and trust and belief in what it is that Jesus can do. In John's story especially, the idea about faith and belief isn't just like a mental checklist of dogmatic statements. It is really a sense of trust, of turning your life over and placing it in someone else's hand, this poor guy from Nazareth. It is an act of knowing that God is faithful, so we would stake our life or our well-being or our future upon it. And so when this man is challenged by Jesus, unless you see signs and wonders, you won't believe, he says, Jesus, just make the 2-day trek back home with me. And Jesus realizes that this man isn't looking for signs and wonders to believe. He already believes. If only for this moment and only this circumstance or forever in the future, we don't really know. But for what matters, he doesn't need to see a miracle. He knows Jesus is more than capable of doing something. And so Jesus says, go, your son's healed. And so what we find is that Jesus interrupts the story of the narrative of even that sort of sense of justice against our enemies. And instead, our imagination is remade away from finding that punishment and pain is the way to set the story straight, and instead, healing and restoration is the goal. Even for those that we don't know, in a land or a place far from us, whose names we haven't recognized yet, whose beliefs may not align with us, who might even be oppressing people. The son was healed at the very hour that Jesus spoke those words. Now, I don't want us to leave the story thinking Jesus doesn't need to be in the room to have a miracle happen. Jesus can do stuff from really far away. Because that's not the story. What we find is that the healing of God was in that room in Capernaum. That God was ever present with those people that for many of John's readers would have never guessed God would be present. That the real miracle that happens is that this foreign adversary, and in fact everyone in their household, family and servants, the entire embodiment of the regime, share the same trust that the disciples found, that the woman at the well found, that they were more alike than what we suspected. That God does not restrict the offer of life and flourishing, the saving, abundant life that is given to God's chosen people, because it seems from our categories that God is choosing everyone. Yeah. That doesn't mean we excuse injustice or we overlook the wrongs that oppression undermine the humanity of other people. It's only that we welcome and nurture the hope for change, that transformation happens without more violence and more oppression and more killing in order to get our way. We don't imagine death as the everlasting reality, but instead, in seeing the way Jesus acts, we know that life is the everlasting reality. And therefore, our imaginations are cast in that direction of how might life change the world around us instead of death. And so in these two stories in John chapter 4, we find how the outsiders, ethnic, religious, political, whatever, that too many people had written off as hopeless. They don't believe like us. They don't act like us. They don't look like us. That not only are these people believing, but they are the ones who then tell others, and others begin to believe too. The woman goes back to her village and says, "You won't believe what I found." And an entire household comes to faith. I know that I'm not alone in my background of being surprised to be here this morning. In a church? That's not how I grew up. You might feel the same way. Some of you would have never guessed that you were here because you wanted to be here. And so we too have been the recipients of that surprising sort of life that seems to come from out of nowhere and yet restores us in ways that is surprising. Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to pray for those who would harm and threaten us, to forgive and to reconcile, to trust that it is not the sword or wealth or status that overpowers all other things. Instead, what we come to know, what we learn, what we believe, what we trust, is that love conquers all. That love saves all, redeems all, so that we can all make it to the promised land together and whole as humanity.